have been on this lectern, as have Jane Goodall's and Kathy Sullivan's, Edmund Hillary's, Tenzing Norgay. And so, it's always, kind of interesting to be here from a historical standpoint. And we have a great historian coming today, so I'm very excited that you're all here. It's perfect timing. Ladies and gentlemen, William Dalrymple. Yeah. So, part of the Golden Road, which breaking news is now on the New York Times bestseller list as of yesterday. A really interesting part of the book is the monsoons and the trade winds, and if you catch them just right, it can help. So the monsoons, William brought the monsoons here, clearly from Southeast Asia. So these flags, really quickly, all have a story, and I'll tell you about it later, but you've been waiting, so I'm going to introduce William now.
How long have you been doing this stand-up?
I just started, and I've got a lot of material. I'm just kidding. I first encountered William about 20 years ago on my first trip to Delhi, and I read City of Jinns, which was how he and his lovely wife Olivia were navigating the bureaucracy of Delhi, and how he was exploring kind of ancient Mughal Delhi. It was coming to life, and he shares a lot of the traits of explorers, right? He's curious, and he's tenacious, and he's a problem solver. And not only was it historic, well, we'll talk about that later. And it was such a page turner, but it was also so rich in history. And so this began kind of how much I love William and his work, and I've read everything, right? And so Xanadu was your trek from Jerusalem to the Old Summer Palace, to White Mughals and Last Mughals, Return of a King in Afghanistan, the beginning of the Great Game, Anarchy with the East India Trading Company, and now the Golden Road, which is an amazing kind of 100 pages of notes, very well researched. It's going to make you rethink the Silk Road and everything you thought you knew about India.
You need to tell the Shanghai stories, Trevor.
So William also has a podcast called Empire, and in these days of kind of perma-chaos, it's a real balm. It's a real retreat when you can listen to Empire. It's so funny. It's erudite. It's witty, just like William. So I got to know him maybe 15 years ago. I recruited him to come to Shanghai for a Lit Fest, and the Rolling Stones were playing in Shanghai, and I said, "Hey, you're coming. Would you like to get some tickets to the Stones?" And William said, "Well, Mick's a mate of mine." And I was like, "Oh yeah." I was like, "Yeah, Mick's a mate here, sure." And then I see this email from Mick Jagger to William, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, holy crap, what's happening here?" And so he said, "Well, let's invite him to a dinner the night before at M on the Bund. If you know Shanghai, right on the Bund. It was the restaurant that started it all, right? VJ was there." And we thought, there's no way he's coming, right? There was about 10 of us. There's no way. And then about 5 o'clock, I got a call that Mick Jagger security people were at the restaurant. And lo and behold, I had dinner with Mick Jagger and William Dalrymple. And it was one of those.
The following night.
Well, I don't want to take your time. So the following night, they put us backstage in VIP, and as you do, and then somebody comes and says, I can't believe I'm telling this story, but I will. Somebody says, "Mr. Jagger will see you now." So we go to his dressing room. So my beautiful wife is right beside me.
Trevor has a very, very beautiful wife.
Thank you. And William's wife likewise. And so we're all sitting, and we're in Mick Jagger's dressing room, and it's like, what is happening right now? And his legs are about the size of my arms. They're really skinny, delightful. And they were talking about 17th century cologne or something. It was like he's also very erudite. And so all of a sudden, he takes his belt off, and it's a Velcro belt. And so as he's taking his belt off, sitting by my beautiful wife, I'm thinking, he was looking at her. He's taking his belt off. And I'm thinking, I'm in Mick Jagger's dressing room. What are the rules here? Like, are there rules here? what's about to happen? Am I happy about it? Like, can I stay? Like, what's going on here? And so, it was a tricky moment. It's a very tricky moment. I'm glad I shared it with you because I needed backup in that moment, and he was just adjusting his belt. So that's all it was. It was unclear for a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a real treat today. Please put your hands together for the great William Dalrymple.
Is this milk? Very good, very good. So, yes, to business, the Golden Road. This book is written as a sort of personal grouch, in a sense. The longer I live in India, and I've been there 40 years, the more I become irritated by the way that the extraordinary greatness of ancient classical India remains almost entirely unknown in the West, which is a kind of weird thing, because India is one of those parts of the world, along with ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient China, which form the roots and the basis and the underpinnings of so much of our civilization. But while in this part of the world, thanks to the European Enlightenment, we all know about the great achievements of ancient Greece. And more recently, we have become well educated in the greatness of ancient China, thanks to this notion of the Silk Road, which has become a very dominant notion in academia, in popular Marco Polo, Netflix, beautiful Mongol princesses, all that sort of stuff. But somehow, there's been, both in the popular level and in an academic level and in our educational system, an almost complete absence of the presence of India. Let me give you one example. I suspect every single person in this room, by their 7th birthday or 8th birthday, knew the story of Archimedes in his bath. He gets up, he shouts Eureka, the light bulb moment. By your 10th birthday or 11th birthday, you would have known, if not before, about Pythagoras and his theorem. But I suspect that not a single person who is not of South Asian origin, and all the Indians will know this from their 3rd birthday, but not. There are these comparable figures in India, Aryabhatta, Brahmagupta, who were the great mathematicians, astronomers, astrologers of ancient India, of whom we know absolutely nothing in this country. To give you some details, Aryabhatta in 300 AD comes up with the exact circumference of the Earth, the exact distance of the Earth to the Sun, and the fact that we are a heliocentric universe, we revolve around the Sun, 1,000 years before Galileo. A generation later, his follower, Brahmagupta, who's very much taken forward the flame, comes up with 36 definitions of zero that basically create zero as a number, not as a placeholder, not as an absence, but as a mathematical powerhouse that allows us to move into a different stratosphere mathematically. Moreover, when joined to the 9 Indian number symbols, allows you to express any number up to infinity with those 9 symbols and 0. Something we take for granted every day. We don't think about it. But that's where those symbols come from. We in the West call them Arabic numbers because we got them from the Arabs, but the Arabs get them from the Indians. And this is part of the story which I'll be telling today. And those 9 Indian number symbols and 0 are one of the great conceptual leaps of mankind. They are also the nearest thing mankind has to universal language. And yet no one is taught this in our schools. No one associates it with India. It's a complete absence. And frankly, it's a very odd thing that this should be so in the 21st century. After, we have whatever it is, nearly a century of decolonization in various forms. But this seems to be a basic facet of human civilization, and you can number on your hand people in Harvard. I've done these book tours through all these universities. No one knows this stuff, or if they do, it's not connected with the wider picture, which is the extraordinary way that India transforms so much of the world around it. We're going to talk today about 3 forms of Indian thought that transformed the world. First of all, the spread of Buddhism, something that isn't even associated with India in many people's minds, but the Buddha was an Indian, born actually just over the border in Nepal, today in Lumbini, but has his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya in Bihar. First sermon in Sarnath, Uttar Pradesh, just outside Varanasi. And these are inherent within Buddhism, and the arguments he's having with his contemporaries are the whole of Vedic Hindu culture, the whole of Indian conceptions of time as a circular thing, and karma, ideas of space and geography. And these travel around Asia with Buddhism and contain the languages and the ideas of ancient India. And they've transformed the whole of Asia. China today is the largest Buddhist country in the world, but the whole of Southeast Asia, Burma, Vietnam, Laos. And even the Indians in this room, who will know Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, are often surprised when you tell them that actually the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, but in Angkor Wat, originally a Vishnu temple. When you go there, it's full of images of the battles of the Mahabharata fought effectively outside modern Delhi, or the tales of Krishna just to the south of Delhi in Mathura. And even in India, people do not know this stuff in the way that they should. This book has been, I'm very glad to say, 6 months at #1 on the Indian bestseller list, because people have there's often in India, there's a frustration that the West doesn't know about the greatness of India, but also there's a sort of sense in which the greatness of ancient India is also something that you associate with your mad uncle's WhatsApp forwards. And, sort of stuff about nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata, or Krishna flying by helicopter to Lanka and the Ramayana, or this sort of slightly madcappy stuff. And so it's got slightly discredited as a sort of far-right, chest-thumpy nationalist thing. But the real story is so extraordinary, it needs no elaboration, no invention, no gilding of the lily to tell. And so I'm going to try in the next half hour to give you a little soupçon of the story of the spread of Hinduism in Southeast Asia, the spread of Buddhism, and the spread of Indian numbers. And probably the best place to start is with Buddhism. But before I say that, the counterexample is our knowledge of China, which has been transformed since the 1980s by this idea of the Silk Road, which is an idea almost tailor-made to fit the Explorer Club's sort of perfect sort of CV. All those gorgeous names of Hamadan, Ray, Merv. Wouldn't you like to go to Merv? Wouldn't we all want to be in Merv now and seeing the fortifications destroyed by Genghis Khan and all that? Kashgar, Dunhuang. I mean, this is almost the kind of, this is all our travel wish list for the next 40 years. And I had always assumed, my first book was following Marco Polo along that route from Jerusalem, with getting some oil from the Holy Sepulchre and delivering it to Shangtu, Xanadu of Coleridge's Opium Dream. And this is the stuff that, us travelers dream about. But I had always assumed that, as this map does, by the fact that the names on it are ancient names, Petra, Palmyra, these cities did not exist by the 6th or 7th century. So I've always assumed that this was an ancient idea that's there in the classical sources and stretches back to the mists of time, blah, blah, blah. Bullshit. This idea is invented in 1877 by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen. Those of you who grew up with sort of British comics will have known about the Red Baron, who was the grandson. Von Richthofen, the fighter race, his grandfather was the von Richthofen, the geographer, who comes up with the idea of the Seidenstraßen, the Silk Roads. And it only enters the English language in 1936 with a Nazi-sympathizing Swede called Sven Hedin. And it's only in the 1980s when the Met has a show, and then the National Gallery of Art, that these ideas become very widely known. And you can see why it becomes widely known. Because it's very sexy. It does a lot of work, those two words, Silk Road. Immediately you're with camels and Dunhuang crossing the sand dunes or over the Pamirs. But this idea is not referenced in a single ancient source. Marco Polo never talks about the Silk Road. And it's my contention in this book that there was nothing even approaching a Silk Road before the Mongols smash a hole through the middle of Asia, allowing Marco Polo in 1271 to make this journey. But did ancient Chinese diplomats go along that road to Gaza and Alexandria? Did ancient Roman diplomats go from Alexandria to Loyang? The hell they did. Ancient China has no conception of ancient Rome other than some vague rumor of a place called Daqing that may be Rome. Likewise, Rome has no conception of China other than a legend about a city called Thebes where silk comes from. Was silk the biggest export product between East and West? Absolutely not. So we've been hoisted with this very romantic idea, with a conception of the world that in antiquity never existed. And not only did it never exist, it excludes, look at India on this map. We have the Himalayas and then nothing. There's not a port, there's not a single, this is taken at random from one of the 40 books published on the Silk Road in the last 5 years. But in reality, read Pliny, read Strabo, read any classical source, read Tacitus. The Romans are worried about India because their gold is bucketing into Indian pockets. Pliny says very clearly, Pliny is a kind of fantastically sort of MAGA figure. So make Rome great again is very much sort of Pliny's angle on things. Pliny says, India is the drain of all the precious metals in the world. Strabo takes the governor of Egypt in the 1st century. He lives in Alexandria, and he's deputed to take the new governor on a tour of his new province. When they get to the Red Sea, just below Gaza and Petra on this map, on the left-hand side, they find 250 ships waiting for the winds to change so that they can sail to India. So on one hand, we have a popular conception of a trade route that never existed in classical times. And on the other hand, a complete absence of any knowledge of a very important trade route that was worrying people in Rome to the extent that they think that their wealth is disappearing. And Rome puts up 30% tariffs on Indian products. And don't tell Trump, but it actually raises a lot of money for the Roman state. And some economists even think as much as a quarter of the Roman imperial military budget comes from this. And we mustn't encourage them in any way. Anyway, so my pitch over the next half hour is that we're looking in the wrong place. In antiquity, it's not China, it's India. And it's not the overland route, it's by sea. And the sea is the next important thing to talk about. Where the Himalayas are is, of course, Tibet. Tibet freezes over in winter. Cold winds rake in. It thaws about now, just like New York has just done, and winds billow out. Those over the continental scale of Tibet mean that you get these extraordinary monsoon winds which gift India something that nowhere else in the world has, which is winds that, in a very un-South Asian, un-Indian manner, are both punctual and predictable and operate outwards for 6 months of the year and then blow inwards. Where I come from, in Scotland, winds just blow in all directions. One day it's this, you know. But in India, you have these extraordinary winds, and therefore, if you are an Indian sailor in antiquity, you can just put up your sail, and once you've learnt, like a surfer learning to surf those amazing waves in Hawaii, and you can use that power like a judo or use your enemy's power against you. Once you've learnt to harness those winds, you are turbocharged up into the Persian Gulf, not the Arabian Gulf, despite a recent prediction, turbocharged into the Red Sea, and eastwards, the same winds blow out through the Malacca Straits, into the Mekong Delta, up into Canton. So India has always had this trading diaspora because you just put up your sail and you're in Mombasa in a couple of weeks. You're in Aden, Yemen, or Egypt. And it's Egypt that we're going to be focusing on in a bit because Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire after the death of Cleopatra, and that is where we see extraordinary things. Anyway, first of all, this is my counter-argument. So look, memorize that map and look at where we're meant to believe Roman traders traveled. Now, if that was true, if you were to map Roman coin hoards, you'd see a straight line across the middle of Asia where those coins are, and you'd see a nice big pile of them at the end in Chang'an. Here's what actually happens, when you map where any pot of Roman coin has been found. As you'd imagine, they're all over the Roman world. They're all over Gaul, Spain, Britain, Italy, Turkey, around the Mediterranean, a little tail down the Nile. None at all in Iran, because Iran was a mortal enemy of Rome, and then Byzantium. A few in Afghanistan, which we'll talk about in a bit. Not one single Roman coin hoard ever found in China. But look at India and look at Sri Lanka. Absolutely plain as a pikestaff. This was Rome's #1 trading partner, and annual fleets are sailing backwards and forwards. So we've got to completely rejig our conception of how this operates. So on the back of that, these ideas travel. So Buddhism. Early images of the Buddha. And the Buddha is a historical character. The Buddha existed in mid-5th century India. But his word barely travels beyond the places that he has been preaching until the Emperor Ashoka comes to power in 250 BC, and he propels Indian ideas out. He has all the fervor of a convert. He converts to Buddhism, and he sends out what he calls his Dharma ministers out into the world left fatherless, in a sense, by the death of Alexander. So you have all Alexander's emperors, Antiochus, Ptolemy, and all the others, Seleucus, squabbling over the post-Alexandrian world. Into that world, Ashoka sends Dharma ministers, according to an inscription in Kandahar as far as Cyrene, which is modern Libya. And in particular, these ideas go out around India, propelling Buddhism down into areas that hasn't existed before. The Deccan, this is the Ajanta caves. Padmapani, the Bodhisattva carrying the lotus at his chest, caught in a gale of stillness. The wonderful rock-cut monastery of Bajjar outside Pune. These are places where Buddhism had not existed before, but now, 150 BC, we're getting enormous monasteries cut out of rock faces all along, down as far as Sri Lanka. And the son of Ashoka, Mahinda, comes down to Sri Lanka, converts the king of Anuradhapura, and eventually dies and is buried. His stupa only turned up 2 years ago, another good Explorers Club destination, Rajagala in the middle of Sri Lanka, a wonderful spot, where you have this sort of prototype stupa, which is like sort of the, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction here. Look at that sort of pile of stones. Compare it to the left, to the finished stupa shape that we associate with Buddhist stupas today. This is like the prototype, Mahinda's stupa, with his name, Mahinda, in Brahmi script. And this is what happens in the 2 or 3 centuries that follow. And it's one of the great miracles of soft power. Joseph Nye died this week, the man that coined the term soft power. He would have liked this map. From the Gangetic Plain, not only do we have the mission southwards to Sri Lanka and Anuradhapura, and across from there to Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Philippines, long way from India. We also have a northwest stab through what's now Pakistan and Afghanistan, where sadly all this conflict is taking place at the moment, through Uzbekistan, through another arrow through Lhasa and Tibet, up to Dunhuang, Mongolia, and beyond this map to Siberia, on through from Chang'an, modern Xi'an, to Korea and Japan. Now, India has very few Buddhists today. Otherwise, this map would be better known there. But it's the greatest triumph of Indian soft power. And it's not just religious and philosophical ideas, it's ideas rooted in all manner of Indian thought, from literature, language, Sanskrit and Pali. A whole world of literature is opened up, which spreads across Asia and changes it forever. You wander around Laos or Cambodia today, or Burma, and you find Buddhist monks in every street, Buddhist stupas on every hill. To this day, Asia is transformed. And this is the sort of thing we're getting in the centuries that follow. This is the equivalent of Lonely Planet from the 1st century. This is, or the Rough Guide. This is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And the Periplus posits a world where the trade routes oscillate between the Red Sea and India. And there is, while there is no known Roman contact with China, there is such regular contact between the West Coast and the Red Sea that you need a guide to sailors to tell you which port of the many on the West Coast you're best sailing to. And it says, you know, if you've got Roman singing boys you want to sell, you go to Barry Gaza, because there's a great taste for Roman singing boys there. But if you want to buy pepper, you should go to Maziris in Kerala, and so on and so forth. Look at Tibet. That's the great landmass whose freezing and thawing creates the winds that are propelling these sailors east and westwards. And we mustn't forget, in the middle of it, Ethiopia, Adulis and Aksum on the left-hand side of the Red Sea. These are major trading destinations. But the spread of Indian ideas to the Red Sea is becoming more and more evident every day. Since I wrote the first draft of this book, this gorgeous head of the Buddha turned up at Berenike. Look on the map again, just again. See Berenike on the Red Sea coast. There's Mussel Harbour. There's Alexandria, then Mussel Harbour, and then Berenike. Berenike is where that Buddha turns up. And this is the kind of most multicultural classical object you can imagine. It's basically a Gandharan head that you'd expect to find in Pakistan or Afghanistan, but it has it's in marble from the Proconessian mines in the Marmara Sea opposite Istanbul, prime classical marble. The tortellini curls, as the Buddha, the archaeologist nicely put it, are drilled with a drill that's only used in Alexandria, so it seems to be made in Alexandria. And it's found in a temple of the goddess Isis on the Red Sea coast in ancient Egypt, erected by a sea captain to thank the Buddha for his safe arrival in the Roman world. And this is extraordinary. We don't know. We didn't know that Buddhist monks were wandering around Egypt. And it raises a whole bunch of questions. By the stage this is carved in the late 2nd century, I've got the date wrong there, it's a century later than that. There are the beginnings, the first, by that stage, Buddhist monasticism is 400 years old. Where does Christian monasticism begin? On the shores of the Red Sea. St. Anthony's of Egypt founds St. Anthony's around this time. So do we see Buddhist influence in Christian monasticism? Is this part of the diffusion of Indian ideas too? We can't answer that question yet, but new evidence is turning up every day. And this is another new piece of evidence. This is the Maziris papyrus, which is merely a shipping invoice, turned up probably in Oxyrhynchus, this amazing hoard of early papyri, which has transformed our understanding of Greek and Byzantine Egypt. This contains a random list of the ingredients, the export products, in one container. And here's what's inside it. This is a mosaic from Sicily, which has the products exported from Rome, presumably erected by a merchant involved in this trade. So we get a figure of India at the front. You see hang on, we're going the wrong direction here. Do you see the busty figure in the center? She is modeled on a Kushan Yakshi, one of these extraordinary fertility figures, these very buxom tree spirits. And the point of this is actually not where all the gentlemen's eyes are straying at the moment, but the very top-hand corner of the picture, where she touches the tree and the tree erupts into flower. She's such a fertile creature that she only has to touch the tree and it bursts into bloom. That's the conceit. Now, the Roman hasn't understood that she's just holding on to a tree. That nothing's happening to it. They've also been distracted by various aspects here. But they get the idea that she's a fertility figure. And she's holding ivory, which is the biggest export from India to Rome, sadly, because it involves obviously the slaughter of elephants. Behind her is pepper, the second biggest export, all those strings hanging down from the tree to her right. And then circus animals. Who's seen Gladiator 2, or that rhinoceros, you remember? So all these animals are brought in from this part of the world at great profit. Behind the tiger's leg is probably malabathrum, which is used in perfumery, along with nard. Remember in the Gospel of Matthew when Christ goes to the house of Martha and Mary and they put nard on his feet, and there's a big argument because should they have sold it to give to the poor? Because it's very expensive. And then, most intriguing of all, look at what she's wearing. She's not wearing much, but she is wearing a wrap of silk. And crucially, look at the bottom of her leg, and you can see her leg and her feet through the silk. Now, this exactly echoes Pliny's complaint. Pliny, remember, make Rome great again, that guy. Pliny complains that all the fashionable liberals in Rome, these decadent women, are wearing what he sort of basically regards as porno wear, the silk. Which you can see women's, he literally uses it, he says you can see the forms of their figure beneath it. And there it is, depicted in the time. This was very much a feature. We have a lovely story told by Tacitus, I think, or that sort of era, of Nero's mistress, Lolina Paulina, who, like many fashionable women in Rome, wore Indian gems. Diamonds were another major product coming out of India. And she wore them on her head, she wore them on her breast, she wore Indian garnets on her tummy buttons, she wore pearls on her shoes. And in a very nice touch, she carried the receipts to parties so she could show her friends how much they cost. This is the conspicuous consumption of... And this appalls Pliny. And the only thing that appalls Pliny more is what's on her top right. He says, what is this woke spice that people are putting on their food? What is this stuff, the pungency that the young like today, this pepper? And for him, this is the appalling, fashionable nonsense, this black spice that people are putting on their food. So this is all the stuff people are buying. And it's not necessities. This is very simply luxury products. And the result is that maybe as much as a quarter of the Roman imperial budget comes from these tariffs charged on these excessive luxuries, which Tacitus and Pliny both complain about, because everyone is buying so much Roman stuff. And we have Indian stuff, and you have all this excessive Indian ivory turning up in Pompeii. But of course, as Trump forgets, trade is two ways, and you get the reverse. So you get lovely Alexandrian glass beakers turning up where? Under the American Air Force Base in Bagram in Afghanistan. We've got Russell Crowe on the left, we've got the Pharos Lighthouse in the middle, and we have the vintage on the right. And this Roman art coming in on the reverse of this trading system, coming into India, transforms the nature of early Buddhist art. Early Buddhist art is aniconic. You get the wheel of the law, you get the flaming pillar, you get the stupa as a symbol of the Buddha, but you don't get the Buddha himself until suddenly on the 1st and 2nd century AD you do. And the Buddha's form is distinctly classical Roman. It becomes even clearer when you put an image of Augustus from the Forum on the left next to a bodhisattva from Peshawar. Look at the drapery. Very, very similar. We don't associate these two worlds, but put them side by side, and they look absolutely from the same artistic toolkit. And so it is that this slightly classicized form of Buddhism passes on into China, where, of course, the Buddha begins to look more and more Chinese. And Buddhism starts off in China in the 1st century as a religion associated with foreigners, but then begins to take down roots. Peasants and aristocrats and townsmen all convert. By the 2nd and 3rd century, you're getting Gupta drapery being crudely copied by Chinese masons. You're getting Ajanta apsaras and Gandharvas and heavenly beings being copied on Chinese and Central Asian tombs. And you're getting Buddhism making inroads at the court and clashing, or certainly competing with the Confucianism and the Taoism, which is dominant at court. And the big change happens when this guy on the right, Xuanzang, with his fancy backpack full of scrolls, leaves China to search for the pure essence of Sanskrit Buddhist and Pali Buddhist sources. He's worried that the sources they're using in China are corrupted. And so he walks through the Gobi Desert, through the Pamirs, into Kashmir, down the Ganges Plain. He's nearly sacrificed at Durga Puja to the goddess, but escapes, and makes it to Nalanda, the great university monastery of Nalanda. Now, we should know about Nalanda in the same way that we know about the Great Library of Alexandria. It's one of the great gatherings of scholarship in the world, but we don't know it in this country. We don't know it in Europe. We know Alexandria, we don't know this. And yet, again, you could make an argument that this has more of an impact on our education system than the Library of Alexandria. Why? Look at that courtyard. Courtyard, cloister garth, scholars' rooms round Forsyth. Where does that ring a bell? Harvard Yard, Oxford, Cambridge. The university campus model that we see everywhere in the world starts here. It then passes through Afghanistan and Persia into the Arab and the Islamic world as the madrasa plan, which you see all over Egypt, North Africa. And then where do universities first start in Europe in the 12th century? Salerno, Bologna, Paris, on the edge of Islamic Spain, and then a century later, Oxford and Cambridge, bringing this plan with it all the way from Nalanda. But it's the Library of Alexandria that is the most impressive thing. 9 stories high. That's why Xuanzang makes the effort. Texts on, he says, on Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, literature, magic. Anyone can borrow them, but they have to put it back in their pigeonhole in the main courtyard every evening. And it sounds great. He says, no undergraduate has ever been more excited to be at university than Xuanzang arriving at Nalanda. He says, the old and young mutually help each other. Students diligently study without wasting a moment. The atmosphere in the monastery was solemn and dignified. And he spends 20 years there copying out manuscripts and then takes it back to China. And this is the shape of the Library of Nalanda. It's a pilgrim's seal, but you get the shape of it. They build another one on that model in Xi'an, which stands there today, the Wild Goose Pagoda. The one in Nalanda is wrecked now. You can get an idea, though, how big it was from this. Look at the scale of it. But that is what is the roots of Mahayana learning in China, comes from Xuanzang back to China. And on the left, we have the copper plate, which shows how international this institution was. The king of Srivijaya, which is modern Indonesia, gifts 100 villages to Nalanda to pay in perpetuity for an endowment for an expatriate college for Southeast Asian monks to study at Nalanda. So like, I know, the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard, given by the truck and jeep maker in India, Mahindra, in order to establish a humanities center at Harvard. So we have in ancient India, the king of Srivijaya raising a large sum of money and sending it to India so that his students can study at this great institution. Now, Xuanzang makes it back to China, where he's received by Taizong, who is the guy on the left, the great emperor of Tang China in its golden age. And just before Xuanzang makes it back, Xuanzang has accepted into his harem this 15-year-old girl called Wu Zetian. Now, she is quite a number. She doesn't look like much in the middle picture here, but she looks a lot better in the Chinese soap opera, which very much shows how she's remembered in China and how she uses her charms. And indeed, she does sound quite a little number. Age 15, she enters Taizong's harem. The 15, incidentally, was not a matter of scandal. That was the age for such things right up until the 18th century. But I can't go back to her. Where is she? Here she's on her horseback. But she somehow manages to pivot out of the bed of Taizong, the old man, into his son's bed. And when he becomes emperor, she's weaked out of the nunnery, put onto the throne, becomes the empress. And then, in a number of moves, there she is becoming the empress in the top right. And then, when he has a stroke, top left, she becomes the regent. And then, at the death of Taizong, she becomes the only woman ruler to rule China as emperor in her own right in the whole 3,000 years of Chinese dynastic history. How does she pull this off? Well, she has her own sort of Project 2025 behind her, who are called the Scholars of the Northern Gate. We have these sinister Tory ones in England called Tufton Street, which is similar. But the Scholars of the Northern Gate, Project 666, as this would be in Wu Zetian's time, are basically Nalanda-trained monks, some of them Indian, most of them ethnic Chinese, who basically perform a coup d'etat. And the Confucians and the Taoists are demoted, and Wu Zetian becomes the first and only empress, but also a Buddhist empress. And Buddhism becomes, briefly for her reign, for 50 years, the state religion of China. This is the high watermark of Indian influence. It goes into reverse at this point, but it's the thing that I think not many people know, that India gives China its state religion for a period of history. You never have the reverse. You never have Indians sort of going over to Confucianism, but we do have Buddhism making considerable inroads, and that is an extraordinary thing. We aren't necessarily that surprised about it today, because today the most Buddhists in the world are in China. But China is famously conservative. Confucianism is a very conservative philosophy, looking to the revering of tradition and ancestors and parents and so on. And when the British turn up in the 18th century, I don't know whether any of you listen to my podcast Empire. We're just doing the McCartney mission at the moment. The British turn up in the 18th century, and they spend 5 years making planetariums and hot air balloons and all manner of sort of gewgaws to try and impress the Chinese. The Chinese emperor says merely, "We have no need of your knickknacks." But they seem to have some need of Indian knickknacks at this time. And you have this major influence of India on China. What happens next, though, is at the same time as this is going on, you're getting a similar thing going on in Southeast Asia. And this time it's not Buddhism, it's Hinduism. We talked about the massive trade between Rome and India. But in the 5th century, Rome falls, and that tap is turned off absolutely. Suddenly, gold stops arriving, which creates a major economic crisis in India, because India has been, just like Saudi Arabia has been living on petrodollars for 70, 80 years. India has been living on pepper, ivory, and nard dollars for 400 years. And India's been able to do, effectively sleepwalk through life with vast sums of money pouring in from pepper and ivory, which are very readily available. But now there is a crisis. No gold's coming. So where do you find gold? You find it in what become known as the lands of gold, Savarna Bhumi, Southeast Asia. When you go on your holiday, summer holiday, Christmas holiday probably, to Bangkok, you will fly into Savarna Bhumi airport. Means the lands of gold. And it's a memory of this time when Indian merchants traveled in ships like this. Where? To these amazing ports in Southeast Asia where all the gold reserves are found, which are going to replace the gold reserves of Rome. And by the 5th century, you're getting small Buddhist statuettes, Shiva lingams, yonis, images of Lord Shiva turning up in Malaysia. You're finding it also on the Mekong Delta, where there's a huge Indic-style settlement at a place called Ok Eo, where the Mekong floods into the lagoon. And nearby at Angkor Baray, you have the first surviving Hindu temple in Southeast Asia. Inside it, you have these extraordinary images of Lord Vishnu and Lord Ram. So by the 5th and 6th century, very widespread adoption of Hinduism, particularly among the ruling classes, and particularly on the little kingdoms that occupied the estuaries, where goods are shipped down from the interior. And you have large numbers of Indian merchants coming along. But the Hinduism of Southeast Asia is slightly different from the Hinduism of India. Look at the top right. That's Jayavarman II, the founder of Angkor. Now, he is holding a conch and a discus, which in Indic sculptural vocabulary is saying, I am Lord Vishnu. Now, that would be absolute blasphemy in India. You see images of Indian kings with Lord Vishnu or Lord Shiva, Raja Chola with Lord Shiva. You don't ever see them as the god. And this is the kind of thing that's going on. You've got these Indian Brahmins with their Brahmin cords. They're turning up. They erect a little pavilion, and they start pouring water over the king, who in this case is called Kadunga. Kadunga suddenly becomes Mullavarman. His son becomes Suryavarman, protected by the sun. And this is all part of a process of conversion into a Sanskritic world, so that all the way from Kandahar right through to Bali, Sanskrit becomes the language of international diplomacy and culture, just like Latin does in medieval Europe or French in 19th century Europe. And you get the beginnings of Indic scripts arriving, or one particular Indic script. This is Pallava Grantha, developed in the Pallava capital of Kanchipuram, and it's the basis. North Indian scripts, I'm sure you will know, have that sort of straight line, the washing line from which you hang the letters. You draw that line, and then you make your letter. You can't do that on palm leaf because the stroke cuts the palm. So you have, for palm leaf writing, to have this circular letter form, which is the basis of modern Tamil and Malayalam script in India, but also of Thai, Khmer, Mon, Pew, all the pre-Islamic scripts of Southeast Asia. And this spreads. And then you have this miraculous transformation of the geography. A new Ayodhya, the capital of Lord Ram, is erected in the outskirts of Bangkok in Thailand. A new Kurukshetra, the great battle of the Mahabharata, appears in Laos. And down the middle of Southeast Asia, the main river is renamed Ma Ganga, or as it is pronounced in Khmer, Mekong. So there's this massive transformation of the geography into a Hindu sacred landscape. Many of the major Shaivite shrines of India reappear, their names reappear in Cambodia at this period as Shaivite step pyramids. The Mekong itself is carved with yonis and lingams into its banks, so that you couldn't have a more clear rendition of it being made into a sacred Indian river. This may, incidentally, have been something to get the Brahmins off the hook, because, of course, in Manu's laws, you're not allowed to cross the Black Water. What are these guys doing in Cambodia? They can just say now, oh, no, this is still India, because there's the Ganges. India is defined in antiquity as having the Indus on the west, the Ganga on the left, and the sea to the south, the mountains to the north. Here is the Ganga. It's the Mekong. Slightly different, but it's the same. You can argue, anyway, that case. And you begin to see Indic temples turning up in Southeast Asia. Here's the Shore Temple in Mahabalipuram on the left. Here is Gedong Songo in Java on the right. Slightly different eaves, slightly different doorways, but basically the same plan. And then you have this strange thing. India remains split between many competing kingdoms, the Chalukyas, the Pallavas, the Pandyas, the Cholas, all these different, and that's just the south. In Southeast Asia at this period, two great empires appear. Sri Vijaya, which is the Buddhist Indonesia, and the Khmer Empire, which, don't tell Mr. Modi, is the greatest Hindu empire ever built, with the largest spread of territory of any Hindu empire in history. And these have bigger resources than their equivalents in India. So while you're having Indic ideas taking root in Southeast Asia, they begin to erupt in sort of megafauna form, if you like. The temples of Prambanan are bigger than any 9th century temple anywhere in India. The first 240-part strip cartoon of the Ramayana is carved in Prambanan. The largest Buddhist monument in the world is Borobudur. And ultimately, the largest Hindu temple anywhere in the world is Angkor Wat. Today, a Buddhist temple, originally a Vishnu temple. And it is a whopper, 4 times the size of the Vatican City within the outer moat. The largest medieval religious monument in the world. Greater Angkor is 1.2 million people at a time when London is 20,000 people. But no longer, by the 12th century, necessarily instantly recognizable as of Indian form. Tagore gets it right, as he so often does. Goes there in 1920, he says, "Everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her." Perfect encapsulation. In the center of the quincunx, the central tower contains the ashes of Suryavarman. Now, you never have the ashes of a Hindu king in the middle of a royal temple in India. You have them on the ghats and the chatris outside. But here it is in the middle. So it's Indic, and it's taken from Indic seeds, and it's of India, and yet it's not Indian. And you somehow, when writing about this, got to get that balance right. Hindu nationalists in the 1930s over-egged the pudding and called these Hindu colonies. They weren't. There was never an Indian political conquest of Southeast Asia. What you get, which is far rarer in history, is an empire of the spirit, where ideas take root through their sophistication, through their popularity. And that's no small achievement in any period of history. Most empires, whether you're talking about the spread of Catholicism in Latin America or the spread of Islam in Persia or India, happen with armies. This does not happen with armies. But the idea from India which spreads furthest are numbers. Here, you can all read that, 270. That's 9th century inscription. You could not read the equivalent Roman inscription without at least thinking about it, MCVXV1. You'd think about it and have to do a sum. So, because of the Vedas, and because the Vedas command that sacrifices need to be aligned to the heavens, there is a group of people, the Brahmins in early India, who are from 2000 BC experts in mathematical calculation. Almost long enough for sort of evolutionary selection to take place. 3,000 years of mathematical thought in the same families. And by the 3rd century, you get the great golden age of Indian mathematics, but Brahmagupta, Aryabhatta. Brahmagupta, as we said, comes up with the idea of 0, and there it is, in the 2nd row middle, the earliest dated 0 in the world, just a dot. Century later, in Gwalior, in this inscription, you get 270 marigolds must be delivered to this temple. And we can read it, because it is our numbers. This is where our numbers come from. Brahmi, in the 1st century, already has a 6 and 7 that looks a bit like our 6 and 7. By that Gwalior inscription, in the 9th century, you've got the 0 and several other letters. 3 is getting to look a bit more like our numbers. And then it goes into 3 different directions. Sanskrit continues with their number system, East Arabic in what's now Egypt and Syria and Iraq, Iran. And then, crucially, the West Arabic numbers in Morocco and Islamic Spain. And by the 16th century, by the time of Dura, our numbers are solidified there. Now, hands up who in the room knew that before? 3, 2, 4 people. You don't count because you're Indian. Non-Indians do not know this, and only in the Explorers Club would you have anyone that even began to know it. How is that possible? This should be absolutely the foundations of our educational system. This is a big deal. This is the universal human language, and no one in this room, even the Explorers Club, the most cosmopolitan crowd in New York, knows this stuff. It's a very bizarre quirk of history. Part of the responsibility, I'm afraid to say, definitely arises with the Victorians. Macaulay's ideas that a single shelf of a good English library is worth all the native literature of English and Arabia. India and Arabia. We laugh at that attitude today, but it remains embedded in our education system and our attitudes. And how does it spread to the Middle East? Well, probably, again, through a Disney character. Jafar from Aladdin, remember him, the guy with the parrot on his shoulder? Jafar is from a family called the Barmakids. The Barmakids were originally called the Pramukhs. They were Sanskrit literate Buddhist abbots from Afghanistan. They convert to Islam. They rise to prominence during the Abbasid Revolution in the 8th century as the Indian accountants managing the army accounts, which they do brilliantly because they have the Indian numbers. They are made viziers. Well, first of all, they found Baghdad. They're made viziers in Baghdad for 4 generations. And the first thing they do is they send to India for the books of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And they arrive in 776. There's a great embassy. And then it takes a couple of generations to get a decent translation. But Al-Khwarizmi eventually turns up from what's now Khiva in northern Uzbekistan. And he produces, so here's a map. So look, how many Sindhis in this room? Any Sindhis? No Sindhis. From Sindh, the books go to Baghdad. From Baghdad, then Khwarazm, up by the Aral Sea. Khwarizmi comes down to Baghdad, and it spreads right through. So Khwarizmi writes, the compendious book of calculating by completion and balancing according to Hindu calculation. Now that's a bit of a mouthful even today in English. It's worse in Arabic. So everyone knows it by a nickname, Al-Jabr, where our word algebra comes from. And Al-Khwarizmi's name becomes the basis of our word algorithm. So these two absolutely foundational concepts of modern mathematics, algebra and algorithm, come from this meeting of Indic and Arabic thought. Al-Khwarizmi is a genius in his own right. It does more. I say he translates Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta is to underdo his contribution. He adds a bit of Euclid. He brings together Greek and Sanskritic learning. But it's Hindu calculation. It's the Indian system. And he's very clear about that. And it eventually, hang on, we're jumping ahead. How does it, let's go back. The reverse button's not doing very well here. Can we get a, yeah, oh, there we go. So, from Baghdad, middle of the map, Iraq, Buyids, the ideas of Al-Khwarizmi are translated and spread through Palestine, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, into Islamic Spain. And by 900, Christian monks in Barcelona are beginning to use what they call the modus andorum, the Indian method. But most of Northern Europe remains still using MCV, XV1, all that stuff. Until a young man is brought by his father to Algeria, when Pisa, look at the top of Italy, you see Pisa. Pisa founds a trading colony in Algeria at a place called Bujaya, which is the same town, incidentally, that Camus wrote The Plague. And then he goes back to Italy to find that all his school friends are still struggling with long multiplication because they're using this ridiculous, long-winded Latin system. So he writes a book called the Liber Abaci, and this guy is Fibonacci. So Fibonacci is the genius who takes the Indic system from Al-Khwarizmi and carries it on to the next stage, which is in Italy. And here is the Liber Abaci. This comes to the attention of the Emperor Frederick II, who goes to Pisa to meet Fibonacci. Imagine Trump going to, I don't know, St. Louis to meet some youthful maths whiz. And thank God he does, because it becomes adopted by the Holy Roman Empire. It becomes the basis for, there's a nice Scottish walk-on part here. He invites Fibonacci to Castel del Monte, which is this gorgeous geometrical castle, and he introduces him to Michael Scott, my compatriot. Michael Scott is the Arabic-speaking ex-Toledo scholar who is in charge of the astronomy and astrology in the Palermo court. And he reads the Liber Abaci and tells Fibonacci this is a work of genius, but being a good Scot, he wants it to be more practical, pragmatic. Look, pal, he says, there's no money lending, there's no usury, there's no weights and measures, there's no currency conversion. So Fibonacci writes a second edition of the Liber Abaci, and that book leads to the founding of the Medici Bank. It leads to Piero della Francesco writing 3 mathematical treatises about the development of perspective and taking Fibonacci's work on. Today we think of Piero as one of the great early Renaissance painters, but at the time he's thought of as the mathematician. And this painting, The Flagellation, is all about perspective. It's an essay on perspective. And then when Piero gets old, his friend Fra Luca Pacioli takes his 3 texts up to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, who's a jobbing painter who is just painting a fresco of the Last Supper in Milan. And this, you got, is Leonardo da Vinci. So you get from Leonardo to Piero, Piero to Fibonacci, Fibonacci to Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Khwarizmi to Brahmagupta, Brahmagupta to Aryabhata. 5 leaps between the math genius of Pataliputra in 3rd century Gupta India and Leonardo designing helicopters in Milan. Unfortunately, the next step is that it goes to England and we get the East India Company, but that's a different story for a different day. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions? Please, sir.
Hi. Yeah, my question was regarding the Southeast Asian king sort of being presented as Vishnu himself.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that as blasphemous in an Indian context, but I think I've heard this idea before that the king is to be seen as like Narayana himself, and I think
I can't think of any examples in India. I mean, I can think of images of Chola bronzes. I mean, Chola figures where you have Raja Chola beside Lord Shiva with his hand on him. But can you think of anywhere where the king is the
I can't think of any in Indian art itself, but generally during Indian weddings, the bride and the groom are often dressed as like Shiva and Parvati or Vishnu and Lakshmi. So I mean, I was just wondering.
Yes, you're right. It's not a huge conceptual leap, but I can't think of a single art example.
Yeah, it's the same here.
Of a Hindu king. There's many portraits of Hindu kings in Indian Hindu sculpture, and many with gods. But they're alongside the gods. They're not the gods themselves. As far as prove me wrong. I'm very happy to be wrong on this one, but I can't think of an example.
No, I agree. Yeah. I mean, I was just interested because I mean, I often seen in weddings, but I haven't seen it in temples myself. But I was just kind of
interesting.
Curious.
You're right. It's not conceptually. It's not a massive leap. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Hi. I was curious how old is Vedic philosophy, and if those concepts had made their way to other parts of Asia earlier.
So this is a hugely contested field, and on sort of WhatsApp forwards, Vedic philosophy is sometimes said to be 30,000 years old, and most serious Sanskrit scholars would put the earliest Veda, the Rig Veda, at about 2,500 BC. Very old, arguably the oldest religious text in the world. But because it's not written down for a long time, it's an orally transmitted thing for its first couple of millennia. It's very difficult to put a date. The way it's usually dated is that its relationship with the Avesta of the Zoroastrians, because they're very similar language. But there's slight differences. For example, Ashura in Sanskrit is a demon, but Ahura Mazda in the Avesta is the great high god. So it's like the goodies and the baddies have been reversed. So there's an interesting relationship between Old Farsi and Vedic Sanskrit. But yeah, 2,500 BC is the answer you'll normally get, but occasionally in India you'll meet people that will add a couple of noughts to that.
Hi, first and foremost, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative and actually very interesting. I have two questions. The first being, why do you think that the spread of the ideology hadn't continued, or why is it currently still localized in that same Southeast area region?
Say again, sir?
Why would you say the ideologies haven't spread like how Christianity or Islam?
Hasn't spread.
Yeah, hasn't.
Okay.
In that same way.
Well, there are small Christian populations, obviously, in India and Southeast Asia, often associated with colonial elites, or occasionally in India with fishing communities and untouchables who improved their lot by converting to Catholicism, for example. But you're right; it's never had the same take.
Okay, cool.
It's a minority faith.
Thank you. And I have another question. What would you say would be one of the coolest stories about ancient India that would be number one action movie, I guess,
I'd say
or something like that?
Probably the math story is the cool
Math story?
Yeah. I was never a great one for maths at school, but I think the story of Zero is a pretty cool story. Yeah.
We have time for one or two more.
This guy here has been patiently had his hand up.
Thank you again for
Thank you.
coming and speaking today. I was curious if you could talk a little more about the exchange of ideas between India and its great empire to the west, Persia. For example, something that I don't know if it's an urban legend or if it's true, but the influence potentially of Zoroastrianism on sort of the biblical tradition, right? And if that has any interchange with Indian culture as well.
So, yes. So as we said, there's a very strong relationship between the Avesta and the Vedas. They are in very similar language, slight geographically separated, but they're clearly cousins. There's a lot of ideas, a lot of gods like Mithras who appear in both. And so there's that early relationship between Farsi and Vedic Sanskrit. You then, of course, get a Persianate phase in Indian history beginning in the 12th century when Persian-speaking courts rule most of India up until the 18th century. And then you get the arrival of Hafiz and Ferdowsi and all that package of culture from the 12th century to the 18th century. As far as Persian culture affecting Christianity, well, yes, the story of the wise men, as we translate it often, but the Greek says magi. The Magi are very specific. The Magi are the holy men of Zoroastrian faith who had a reputation as astronomers. Now remember that the Jews of early first century Palestine had close contacts with the Persians because the Babylonian exile and all that stuff in Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, the freeing, the enslavement and the freeing of the early Jewish people in Persia. So the Jews knew that the Persians had this expertise in astronomy. So however you interpret it, it makes sense to send Persian astronomers to Bethlehem to go and see the newborn king, because that's what Persians were renowned for being the clever astronomers. So if you wanted to get someone clever in astrology to predict the birth of the new god, the new king, you'd send Zoroastrians to do it. And that's what the gospel text says. It's St. Matthew, one gospel, which is the most Hebrew of the gospels.
Maybe one more?
Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
But could you explain why in Southeast Asia it seems like the Indian influences of Buddhism and Hinduism seem to coexist and survive together, whereas in India the Buddhist influence has been pretty much supplanted by Hinduism and Islam?
Very good question. So you get this period from about 500 to about 1200, when you're right, in both India and in Southeast Asia, Hinduism and Buddhism are coexisting in every town, often competing for resources. And for whatever reason, it's basically the Hindu faith which gets the most government support, if you like, in India. Particularly the Rajputs don't particularly, these warrior kings don't particularly like the idea of non-violence. They certainly don't like the idea of vegetarianism. And they want to be able to go hunting and make war and do the things that kings do. And so they patronize Hindu gods rather than Buddhist ones. The more complicated question to answer is why Buddhism is the one of the two that wins in Southeast Asia. And there's not much coexistence today, because actually Hinduism has disappeared from most of Southeast Asia, except Bali and Lombok. You will not find Hindus today in Cambodia or Thailand or Burma. You'll find occasionally Hindu gods lurking in the Buddhist pantheon. So occasionally you might find a figure of Ganesh, for example, in a Buddhist picture. An elephant god will be there. But for whatever reason, Southeast Asians basically end up patronizing Buddhism. And Buddhism is the principal faith of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Bali today. And Hinduism is overwhelmingly the winner in India. It's a very complicated question. I don't know the full answer, but that's what happens.
Ladies and gentlemen, William Dalrymple. Yes. So William will be signing books here, and September Jaipur Lit Fest is in New York. So we'll make sure to circulate those dates. Thank you all for coming.
Where should I sit?
Out here.
I can come out here.
Yeah, let's come out here. Much better. Outstanding.